Hi, just a quick background on me. I'm Raymond Cozby. Can y'all hear me? Yeah. I work for Freeport-McMoRan as a reservoir engineer, and I've been going to UL at the same time. I graduate in December, just like he said. So my presentation is over my thesis, which is fracture conductivity and its effects on production estimation, and I'm happy to be here presenting with y'all today. So the overview of my presentation is going to start with my literature review, the objective of my study, the significance of my study, what is fracture conductivity, my approach to the solution, my model setup, my results, and finally my summary and conclusions. When I first started doing my thesis and working on it, I had to conduct a literature review, and this is where I went through a bunch of papers, and ultimately I kind of narrowed it down to fracture conductivity as something that really hasn't been studied too much in shale plays. And I wanted to focus on hydraulic fracturing as well. This is a huge source of energy for the oil and gas industry, and it's kind of slowed down as of late. So what I determined is fracture conductivity needs a better understanding. Most engineers assume it to be negligible, especially in these shale plays, because it doesn't play such a large role. And partly because of infinite acting reservoirs and how the fracture interacts with a reservoir. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But what I broke my literature review down into is geomechanics, reservoir simulation, fracture geometry, and conductivity. And here, okay, well, it's really large, but here's a list of my papers over here on the left and what they're about. And this is a timeline. You can't really see it, but all my papers range from 1985 to 2016. So I've studied kind of the course of how hydraulic fracturing has changed throughout the industry. And there's some good authors up there. I know it's hard to see, but Warpinski, Zobak, and BO are some of the authors I was reading. So moving on, the objective of my study is to develop a better understanding of fracture conductivity. I wanted to create a model that could be used in the field by engineers and could be applied. Observe the effects of depletion, how fracture conductivity changes over time, and then I didn't quite get to this, but improve the economics of a well, which is what the oil and gas industry is about. Make economic wells and hopefully produce a profit, and then improve fracturing techniques. The significance of this is, as most of you all know, the price of oil is $50 today. 2 years ago it was at $100. So what I want to help engineers do is make wells economically viable, and maybe tweaking something small like fracture conductivity could go a long way towards doing that. I would like to hopefully this study will increase the recovery factor of a well, and maybe make a longer well life or a shorter well life depending on how fast you produce it, and then increase knowledge of fracking. So what is fracture conductivity? It is a measurement of how well a fluid will flow through a fracture. And I know for some people that might not know, the fracture is kind of created with pressure, and then sand is pumped into it and it's propped open and held open. The sand or proppant has a certain, it's called permeability, and that's technically how well a fluid moves through the media, or the porous medium. But specifically, conductivity is the fracture permeability times the fracture width, okay? And that can be a misleading term for some wells, because you could have a really long fracture compared to a short one, and you could get a higher or a wider fracture, or a shorter or a smaller fracture. And so Pratt kind of came up with a way to compare fracture conductivities, and that's the dimensionless conductivity, which is right here. And that all that is the conductivity, the first term, divided by the reservoir permeability times the fracture length. That will give you an adequate way to compare almost any fracture that you see in the world. It takes length out of it, but one of the most important things is when looking at the upcoming information is the fracture or the reservoir permeability in this shale is so low, it's nanodarcies, which is times 10 to the ninth, that this K right there usually tends to drive this way above 10, the dimensionless conductivity way above 10. And so if the dimensionless conductivity is above 10, a fracture will be infinite acting. So what does that mean? It means the fracture along the well will act as if there's no boundary for the reservoir. It's like it almost pulls oil into the fracture. There's no real, it doesn't seem to run out of oil from where it's pulling. So my approach to the solution, I used an eclipse model to run sensitivities to address the following aspects. Proppant settling mechanisms. The two I tried to mimic in my simulation were forward and backward settling mechanisms. And forward uses kind of like a slick line, and what it does is as you open up this fracture and pump in sand, the sand kind of pushes out farther and farther, and what that creates is a small fracture profile. It's a long, skinny crack. And then versus a backwards, which uses a gel, which is a thicker, viscous fluid. And what that does is when it opens up the fracture, it pushes all the sand to the back of the fracture and works backwards. And then different types of proppant, sand versus ceramic. Sand is just a normal everyday sand, and then ceramic is is improved, better, high quality sand that will create a larger perm in the fracture. Then I kind of try to look at one fracture versus multiple fractures in the well and how they interact. And then I tried to observe the effect of depletion over the life of the well. So I picked the Eagleford Shale. So Austin is right up here, and it's a shale play, and it goes right down here, and Mexico's right here, but the shale play continues on. And what it has is got an oil, a wet gas, a dry gas, and a gas zone, or just a wet gas zone. And what it is a large shale reservoir. Currently, a very significant drop off in rig count, which means there's less wells being drilled here, and so that's very important for them to be economic, so that you can make money. If they're even more important. Almost all of them are horizontal wells, which is another good reason for using this study for that. And information gained from the study could be applied to the future. So one of the main modeling techniques that I used to help me view these fractures was local grid refinement. And in Eclipse, you use a keyword, which in Eclipse is a keyword-driven reservoir simulator. And the keyword is Carfin, and what it does is it takes a grid like this, and it takes one grid block, and you can you don't shrink it, you dice it up into smaller grid blocks. And what it does is when you have the smaller grid blocks, you can get a better look at your fracture as it goes out. Instead of having one large area around it, you can really zoom in on it. The problem is there's a couple limitations with Eclipse. The wellbore diameter has to be 0.25 feet, which isn't a problem, but if a grid block is smaller than that, the simulation will not flow into the well because it doesn't recognize it. And these fractures are 0.01 feet to 0.1 feet. And so you have to adjust the grid blocks, which makes you adjust the fracture permeability. And to do that, I came up with this equation right here. And what it does is it's the equivalent fracture permeability, and you have to come up with an equivalent width, and you kind of adjust the permeability and the width to adjust to the grid block size. And so the grid blocks around my fractures are 2 feet, and the local grid refinement takes the grid block around my fracture down to 20 grid blocks, so it's zoomed in. This is a good way to focus on fractures. It gives a much more realistic flow than having a large grid. And you kind of have to juggle how many, I could shrink it down to 100 blocks, but then around each fracture, but there's 17 fractures in the well, and then you kind of start juggling simulation time versus the number of blocks, and the size of your model. So 2 gives accurate result. 2 feet grid blocks gives accurate results. So here's my simulation model data. This chart on the left is kind of my grid data, and what that is. So the reservoir is 300 feet thick. The permeability is 8.5 nanodarcies. The porosity is 8%, and the reservoir itself is 1,600 by 5,000 by 300 feet. The number of blocks in the X direction are 40, in the Y direction 100, 20 in the Z. Initial water saturation is 20%, initial gas saturation is 0%. So it's all oil, no gas, with a little bit of initial water. And what's really important is this, and then here's our rel perm table, and that's just to set up the models to properly allow fluids to flow. And then this chart right here is what I matched. It's the actual fracture fluid data taken from a well in the Eagle Ford Shale. And I tried to match the volumes of my fractures, the length, width, and height, based off this volume of frac fluid to give an accurate model. And then what's important is it's 17 stages, and the average fracture width is 2.02, and the average connectivity is 1529. So this equation uses these variables, and that's how I came up with 2-foot grid blocks and the permeabilities that you will see in the upcoming slides. So, and then here's a top view of what the well actually looks like. It's each fracture, there's 17 fractures, and it's a horizontal well. It's 4,200 feet in length for each fracture, so a half length is 2,100. The space in between is 80 feet, and the total length of the well is 2,000 feet. And so next, you're going to see I have 7 models, and here's going to be the description of each model. It's kind of okay. So I have 7 models. The first one is the base case, and it's this one right here. And it's the perm in all of the fractures is 764 millidarcies, okay? And then Model 2 and Model 3 are the forward settling proppant and the reverse settling proppant. And and so on the forward settling, because it kind of stretches out and the sand pushes out towards the tip of the fracture, the higher perm in the fracture is going to be near the wellbore, which is these tan blocks. And then the perm gets lower as you stretch out towards the tip, okay, in each fracture. Model 3 is exactly the opposite, because it starts at the tip of the fracture and works backwards. And so those have the highest perm at the end of the well. And then the next, I have 4 more models, so Model 4, Model 5, 6, 7. Model 4 and Model 5 are similar. Those are the 2 that need to be compared. And what those are is I've essentially tried to pump ceramic in the model proppant into each of these red zones, kind of, so an improved higher perm proppant. And so Model 4 and 5 are testing where along the well would be the optimum place to put a higher or increased permeability. And so I've got 2 at the end and 2 at this end, and then in the middle, to trying to test the ends versus the middle of the well. And then Model 6 and Model 7, these are testing whether or not ceramic proppant is more efficient at the tip of the well or near the wellbore, okay? And so up next, you're gonna see my results. Before you kind of get sucked in, they're gonna look really similar, okay? And just bear with me. So here is the initial 30-day production rate. This is all 7 models posted up here, and they're all from 4 days on, they're almost identical, okay? The initial rates are what kind of determines which well is more productive. And the best way to compare these is looking at the highest productivity index. And what that is how many barrels of oil you give up per PSI of pressure. And that's listed up here at the top. And you can see Model 7 is the best, okay? It's got 7.2, and you kind of want to compare it to Model 1 at 6.83. So Model 7 and Model 6 are Model 7, and then Model 4 and 5 are exactly the same. And keep hitting the button. And then Model 3 is the worst, which is the reverse settling, and then Model 2 has pretty good results, and it is the forward settling. So why is everything so similar? And that goes back to the infinite acting reservoir, okay? And it does that because this initial rate, you can create a larger pressure drop with some of these better wells, like the ceramic. And so you can actually pull oil in, and then they kind of normalize and they go right in, and they equal each other. But you'll see the same thing. Cumes, they all kind of go up to about 70,000, very similar. And this is the cumulative production. Once again, the PI doesn't really change, but I think it's important to kind of see these. It is worth noting, Model 7, using the ceramic near the wellbore, I think produced is 350 barrels more than the base case of just one sand type. And if you multiply that by 50, it comes out to be, I think it's like $16,000. Or so if you can come up with a way to put ceramic proppant in your well for less than $16,000, it's economic. I don't know, it's probably not possible right now. It's kind of cheap, but and what's really kind of cool is the best way to kind of look at this is, keep hitting this button, is the result, is the change in productivity index compared to Model 1, okay? So what this is the productivity index, that number that I showed up here. And what it is this shows Model 1 as the zero axis, and the other models are compared to it. And right here, it's not really important whether it's plus or minus, it's just the difference from Model 1. And as you can see, Model 7 is the best case right here, and they all kind of shrink down. So what's happening in this early time is at 4 days, the near wellbore effects end. And when I say near wellbore effects, the wells are acting in a 3D radial kind of production, so they're pulling from all directions in the well around the fracture, okay? And then as you get past 4 or 5 days, it just comes into two-dimensional flow, and it's much slower, and there's not as much change in between the models. And here's kind of an interesting, when you zoom in, like on this chart, this is the same chart as that, but much farther down in time, and the axis up here is 0.15 and negative 0.35, and then this is 0.0001 and negative 0.0001. So it's zoomed in on the x-axis big time. And at this point right here, at 210 days, they all kind of converge to each other. And what that shows is the fractures have filled in the drainage area in between the fractures, and then they start to pull farther out from the reservoir. And you can kind of see they start to move away from each other. And then about at 900 days, they reach the edge of the reservoir and then start converging towards each other. So summary and conclusions, I know that's kind of a lot to take in 20 minutes, but to kind of wrap it up, Model 7 performed the best because of the increased average conductivity. So it had a larger ceramic right near the wellbore. And then fracture conductivity plays a very small role in the actual production changes of a well. But the small changes in the proppant design could create a larger initial rate, and maybe at a higher price could make a well more economic. Infinite acting flow takes over because of the low permeability reservoir. The optimum placement for a sand would be or a higher perm sand would be near wellbore, and I would advise using a ceramic proppant. You're going to be more productive. And then where the fracture is located along the wellbore with regards to fracture connectivity doesn't really make a huge difference if all you're changing is fracture connectivity. And then the fracture connectivities all reach the drainage areas at the same time, but it depends on what rate you're producing at. Okay. Thank you. So open it up to questions.
Excellent job. We'll open up to the judging panel first to get some questions that they may have. Judges?
300 barrels increase. Is that over only the 30 days?
Yes, but then once you, for the total account, they all kind of converge towards the same 320,000 barrels a day. But yeah, the increase is at 30 days.
So in the total cume, what was the difference? You said they all converge the same, but I know it can be a minute amount of difference, but what is that minute number?
It's like 10 barrels, 10, 20 barrels, because they produce for so long, at 4 years.
And what is the difference in cost between ceramic proppant and the other
I don't have that data.
In fact, my question has to do with the proppant also. I'd like to know what was the difference between the sand and ceramic? Was the ceramic just a uniform proppant of a particular size, and the sand was a distribution, or what were the differences between the two?
So the sand that was used is probably just like a 2040 Brady sand. That's just a normal everyday sand, and
It's common.
yeah, and so ceramic proppant, there's a bunch of different ways you can do it. I didn't know an exact ceramic to use, so I doubled it. But usually you can coat it, you can resin coat it, or you can improve it. You can get better sorting, which is a more a better shaped sand that they all look similar. You all get round beads of sand instead of it's different shapes of sand, which creates a better flow.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the difference. I didn't pick an exact sand for the ceramic, but
I was more interested in like the size distribution. So if use the 2040 sand and the ceramic, you're saying it had an average size of something that was a little larger than that, right? Is that what you're saying?
no, they can be similar, but it's like playing. It'd be like a perfectly round ball versus like
The geometry is the same versus the others vary.
Yeah.
Right, versus variation size. That's what I'm
yeah.
looking
Oh
at.
yes, but
Okay, so, all right. And, go ahead, Jeff.
Raymond, you said that that the shale that you modeled was primarily or maybe totally oil rather than any gas.
that's just for simulation, just so you can see oil flow rates. It's easier to model.
Okay.
Because once you get
What would be the variation or the difference or the difficulty if you were looking at a percentage of gas also in that well, or in
the difference in production,
Yeah.
it's not as easy to quantitate what's actually going on.
In the simulation.
Yeah, it would still produce this. They would still produce the same essentially, but the gas you wouldn't be able. You're just taking another variable out of the simulation, so you can see exactly what's going on. Does that make sense?
How often in actual shale do you have 100% oil?
Never.
versus-
I'm pretty sure. A lot of times you could get a really good well, but a lot of them are gas wells.
Okay.
It's a reservoir by reservoir. It's called saturated versus unsaturated.
Yeah, it depends on.
Saturated has a small gas cap, unsaturated is completely oil.
But eventually,
Even with oil, when you change, you bring it to the surface, gas breaks out of solution, whatever oil, you get some gas.
yeah.
Yeah. I have a couple of things. One thing you talked about, the forward versus back placement of both the ceramic and the sand. And you saw initially some fairly significant differences in that type of treatment. What do you think this says about two things? Okay, one, the kinds of gels, or should we be using gels doing fracturing? Because a lot of times the gels were used so that you could get this backloading. and they tend to cost more, and there's a lot of R&D that goes into that. So, you know, and like we've had all these guar price ranges and whatnot. So that's one. What do you think of that? If the model, you think of that? And the second one has to do with refracking. Refracking has become a very important thing, where when a well slows down, you go back and refract. Does your model seem to indicate that if you use the ceramic to start out, a ceramic well, because it produces so much at the beginning, if you refract it early, may actually produce more long term? And again, these are just opinions. I just want to hear what you have to say about it.
So with the like the slick water or the gel, they actually do kind of like a hybrid frac, and they mix them up. I've only seen 3 before, but so they tend to use a combination of both. But for just the experiment, I wanted to see kind of what the difference was on that first question. And then refracking, I don't have any experience with that, but based off this, I would recommend it, because it's all about maximizing your contact with the reservoir, and if you're not getting the production you need for an economic well, I would advise fracking again, because once again, you're gonna go out into the reservoir, create more contact with it, and possibly open up more area with the reservoir. And essentially what you want to do is, the perm's so low on these, it's like once you get outside of the fracture or away from the fracture, you don't really see a whole lot of results. So that initial production is really big for these wells. So refracking would just recreate that.
Would recreate that.
That's
right?
what
Okay.
I would think.
No, because that's basically what the industry thinks. They think that you refract, you recreate, but what I'm saying is, you've shown that there may be a way of increasing initial production. Long term, you know, everything looks the same. But that's, I think, what industry would like to see is, you know, an increase, and then when they refract, to get another increase.
Yes.
So that instead of taking 4 years to do the same well, it'll take 3 years or 2 years.
Yeah, and I think that's a good idea if you're floating around, if you're above $50 a barrel.
Right, right.
That makes something interesting, something some of Chevron's economic projections. You're actually better off not having as high a rates to begin with. You gotta get reach payout, but because the projection of pricing to be higher a little in the future versus today.
Right.
Well,
Sometimes you go through all economics. Now, of course, you gotta reach payout quickly, otherwise you're not in business.
Right, right.
You gotta pay out means the time you get your money back.
Right. Yeah.
So sometimes you do net present value, you can pay your reach payout, but if it's a 300 barrels a day for 5 years, it's better than 500 barrels a day now than
Right.
100 barrels later.
Right, if it's $100.
Because you don't get the projection of price oil will be higher in the future.
Right.
Well, excellent. We're going to go ahead, and we'll have time at the break at the end of the conference. We'll take a little break too in the middle, but let's give another round of applause for Raymond. That's an excellent job.